Good evening, everyone. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets. Welcome to today's webinar on international trade. As you know from these webinars, we have chat. If anyone is interested with a comment, it is a rather lively topic, shall we say, this morning. Kind of exploded over the weekend, which I'll talk about briefly. Please put in your comments in chat. I'll be glad to stop and answer almost any comment we have, including film criticism and art history. I am knowledgeable about everything, of course. That's why FX Street wants me to do these webinars. Anyway, a most interesting news flow this weekend. It's not specifically on, of course, trade, but it is all of a piece on international topics. And of course, I'm talking about President Trump's temporary ban on immigration from 5 countries, 7 countries actually. I can't name them offhand. Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Iran, Sudan, Iraq, and Syria. I can name them. How about that? It has excited an incredible amount of news flow. I mean, so much so that I woke up this morning and I checked my email, and the first thing I saw was an email from my sister discussing this policy, and we've been going back and forth ever since. So the topic is extremely volatile, particularly here in the United States, as we are a country of immigrants and have a long history of being mostly amenable to immigration from various parts of the world. I say mostly because there have been periods where we were not. There was a period where we were very unfriendly to immigration from China and Asia. There's another period during the beginning of the First World War where we refused to take any refugees from Europe. So there are periods, and there's also a strain, as there is in every country, of nativism and isolation and all sorts of things. The Irish got very difficult reception here when they came, and on and on and on. This type of opinion is very common and it's very human. It wasn't created by Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not necessarily exciting it. So there's a great deal of misinformation and emotionalism about this topic. And it's tied very closely to the entire topic of international trade. The chart you have on the screen is the longest run I could get for the international trade deficit of the United States. That line is actually at 3. I couldn't get it quite on 0, but it's approximately the 0 line. And you can see that through the early 80s, the U.S. essentially had a mild trade surplus. The interesting thing about the U.S. economy, really until the 1980s, was that it was largely an autarkic economy. What does autarky mean? Autarky means an economy that basically doesn't trade at all with other nations. An example of that would be North Korea. Now, the U.S. wasn't autarkic because of a political idea, but because from the Second World War on for a generation, the U.S. had the most dominant position of an economy in the world that probably had ever existed. We made everything here, and we had no real reason to buy anything from anywhere else in the world. That's really all it was. Much of the rest of the world's industrial base was destroyed in the Second World War. Britain, France, Germany, the countries of Southern Europe. China was in revolution and never had that much. Japan. So there really was very little around the world except for the United States. That is the high, sort of the halcyon days for the US economy and for people whose worldview and economic life in the United States was brought up under that era. Almost anything would be a decline. So part of the emotionalism and the emotions that come from the trade dispute, part of them are based in that. I mean, I remember very well when I was a young child, and my father was a machinist in trade. And my mother was a school teacher. So they had different points of view on this particular topic. My father's point of view was of the factory worker whose factory was beginning to be displaced in those days by production elsewhere. And my mother's was much more of the universal internationalist idea and the international trade idea of comparative advantage, that all these goods are coming into the United States at a much cheaper rate, and therefore this is a benefit. Both things, of course, are true. So what we're going to do is I'm going to try and discuss the sort of the general. Now, I'm not an economist and I'm not a statistician, but I will try and discuss some of the sort of the general idea of comparative advantages. Comparative advantage. This goes back to all the way back to Adam Smith in the late 18th century, and the idea of why nations trade with each other. And comparative advantage is the idea that if I'm good at making, I don't know, macrame plant holders, but I'm no good at making pots, cooking pots, and someone else is good at making cooking pots, and what we should do is trade a number of macrame plant holders for a pot, and the pot holder can hang up their plants and I can cook my dinner. There's nothing odd about this. It's a natural, it's a natural, you could say it as well to express it. What Adam Smith did was express in economic terms what is a natural function of human culture, human life, the different distribution of resources, and the different ways in which human culture express themselves in the world. We could argue or discuss probably forever, especially if we have a couple of bottles of wine, why it is that German cars are so sought after around the world. We can discuss it without ever coming to a conclusion, but it would be difficult to deny the fact that they are. That however it works, that German engineering is a expression of German culture, and it is, must be, we can't deny the fact. And on and on and on like this as far as American software, French wine. You can go on and on about why it is that certain nations, but it's really certain cultures, do some things better than others. This is the basis, one of the bases of comparative advantage, not the only one. Another basis of comparative advantage is not really comparative advantage. I mean, when Adam Smith was talking about it, he's talking about people who do one thing better than another. German cars versus French wine. German wine's okay. Some is pretty good. French cars are okay. But when you're looking at comparative advantage, that's what you have. So that's one type of trade, the basis for trade. That's one type. But that's not the only type. Because comparative advantage also works into price. For instance, When I buy power tools, I've been buying them for years. Originally, they almost all came from the United States. Now, many of those same brands are made overseas, many of them in China, but in other places too. I think of one particular brand, Milwaukee. Milwaukee, well, that's a city in Wisconsin, and that's what the company is named for, Milwaukee Tools. Now, the Milwaukee drill that I buy, made in someplace in China, is no better than the Milwaukee drill made in Milwaukee. So there is no comparative advantage on quality or on expertise at making a particular product. There is, however, and this is the other type of comparative advantage, a great deal of comparative advantage in price. Because for a manufacturing company, the greatest input cost are wages, probably followed by either, I guess it depends on the industry, either raw materials or interest costs, money costs, finance costs. So this comparative advantage is not because the Chinese make power tools better than the Americans, therefore you go to China to get your power tools. It's simply because the wages and the product produced in China is far cheaper. And that is really the competitive advantage that we're talking about. This is the competitive advantage between nations that now tends to dominate much of the international trade. I mean, there's a good question if you think about it. The competitive advantage that would bring or the wage advantage that would bring Milwaukee's power tool business to Guangzhou, I don't know where it is in China, someplace in China, must also exist for cars. But perhaps not. As the product becomes more sophisticated, cars being right now certainly the most sophisticated, and they are phenomenally sophisticated, products of our modern industrial age that are accessible to everybody. It may be that those products, because it's certainly true that here in the United States, and I think many other places as well, that, well, it's not entirely true. I'm just realizing that something here. As the sophistication of the product goes, the quality control becomes more and more important. It doesn't take much in an item as complicated as a modern automobile or a modern airplane to put that item, that vehicle or that airplane, to cause problems. So the quality control has to be phenomenally rigorous. And far more of that depends on the worker on the assembly line than I think non-factory workers realize. It's very, very difficult. I mean, if you think about it, it's absolutely astonishing that anyone in the developed world can go out and buy a car. If you actually think about what is involved in putting that item together. nobody can fix cars anymore because they're so sophisticated. You've got to go to some place where they can plug in the computer and tell you what's wrong with it. So that degree of sophistication is astonishing. So that degree of quality control is one of the, it has been one of the inhibitors of moving very advanced industrial processes overseas. However, that is diminishing by leaps and bounds. The US has long been importing cars from Mexico. American manufacturers who take their production to Mexico simply for the wage differential because they're cheaper. The idea that this is somehow dangerous, is somehow unfair, is one that is relatively recently evolved. However, it has gotten elected in the presidency of Donald Trump here in the United States. So it behooves us to think about the other idea. It has been so, and it's not, I'll explain what I mean. Let me just put up another chart here just so we have some variety. This is post-war U.S. international trade deficit. I tell you, by the time I get back to my desk, there's probably going to be another 10 emails from my sister. We've had a very lively discussion this morning. So this is trade. This is a better chart actually. This is 1950 to 1980. 1950 to 1980. Or is it 1990? Hold on, let me a second. Hang on one second here. Yeah, it's 1950 to 1980. Yeah, let's look at that one. It's 1950 to 1980. Okay. So you can see that for application window, there we go. Okay, sorry. So you can see for a long period there, but even when you look at this chart, the interesting thing for the United States is that this period here, from 1950 to about 1970, even with the US at full economic flowering, we imported very little and didn't sell that much overseas. And as I said earlier, the reason was not any economic philosophy of autarky, but simply because we made everything here. And so any change from that almost 100% status is going to be reflected in the statistics, and that's exactly what happened. All right. This originally here is I believe the first oil embargo over the 1973 war between Israel and her surrounding states. Israel, Egypt, and Syria, I believe. And then everything changes. Let's take another look. This is 1980 to the present. Zero is way up here. So a very persistent deficit. Now, what does this mean among many other things? Well, the first thing that it means, which gets routinely ignored, is that the US is a very wealthy country. Its people are very wealthy. They have an enormous amount of disposable income, more than anywhere else in the world. And they can afford to buy things from overseas. That's all it means. Not all of this represents factories moved overseas and sending stuff back to the United States. Most of it does not. Some of it represents oil, which now with fracking, the US will end up being an oil exporter very shortly. but it represents the accumulation of enormous wealth for spending. So I always thought that you have to look at the merchandise trade deficit, which is what this is, apart from the idea of comparative advantage and what other factors may need to be brought into the idea of comparative advantage. And those factors are represented in the election of Donald Trump. And whatever else you can say about Mr. Trump and his ideas, it is, and his administration's ideas, and the people elected him, it is certainly true that he represents a reversal and a threat to the ideas and the policies and also the beneficiaries of the last 50 years of policy and economic thought in the United States. So some of the vehemence projected or thrown at Mr. Trump and his administration, it's only been a week. Remember, it's a week now. Is the anger of displaced rulers, of displaced ideas that has essentially been rejected by, whether you like it or not, half the Americans. Half of America essentially voted for Donald Trump. This is an idea which I think in its surprise has truly and genuinely shocked the purveyors, the supporters of the ideas of unlimited free trade, among many other things. That's one of them. So let's take a step back if we can, and try and examine what we mean and what is encompassed. I mean, I have a piece here, and this is from both sides. I have a piece here from the Cato Institute, which is very much a libertarian, free market, semi-republican think tank. And the title of this piece, which I did not have a chance to read, "Withdrawing from the TPP," that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, "was a senseless act of wanton discretion." That's not from a democratic organization. That's from a borderline republic. That's from a Republican organization, although they tend to be quite libertarian. So the criticism of this idea is vehement and vociferous and very, very numerous from both sides of the political spectrum. So is there any idea behind this? Or put it another way, are all these people just dumb? Do they not understand that international trade, the idea of comparative advantage, provides benefits to a general population? So where does this idea come from? One, it comes based on logic, and also history, just the essence of, not the essence, but the sort of the economic expression of human culture. After all, the Romans did not really know where silk came from, but they desired it greatly. So the Romans couldn't have gone anywhere else for silk because nobody else offered it. Rome needed grain to survive. Can they not grow grain in Italy? Of course they can. Then why did the Romans, by and large, go to the Greeks went to the Black Sea, and the Athens, 400 years before that, went to the Black Sea, and the Romans went to Egypt? Why did they go there for grain, and why did that trade evolve? Because it was much more efficient, for whatever reason, I'm saying because there's more to it than simply a better climate. It was far more efficient to grow a grain surplus in the Nile Delta, the Nile Valley, than it was in Rome, in Italy. Therefore, that particular, and this is long before political economy, this is long before arguing about trade. The trade evolved because it is a natural condition of life and human life on this planet that these things are differentiated. That it is more efficient growing grain in the controlled riverine environment of the Nile than it is in Italy. Now, part of that may be the type of culture that the Egyptians had that permitted the very liberal use of labor. But then the Romans had a slave culture too. So it is more than, without making judgment about the cultures involved, it is simply a fact that that is almost a natural occurrence. As soon as the political conditions permitted, political and economic conditions, permitted that trade, and also the technological ones, you need the ships to get from Alexandria to Ostia. Ostia is the port of Rome, the ancient port of Rome. As soon as that existed, the trade developed. So the idea of this advantage is not an invention of the modern world. It's not an invention of China or the United States or anything else. I mean, I was looking through a number of auctions. I like going to auctions. And there's an auction house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire that has a series of auctions that I find fascinating. And one of the auctions that they have every summer focuses on marine trade, and primarily the 19th century trade with China. In the 18th and the 19th centuries, the Chinese had and I've explained this to my girls. In English, what do we call fancy dishes? It seems so obvious, but I'd bring it up anyway. Well, we call them China. And why do we call them China? Because that type of very high quality porcelain and ceramics was perfected, if not invented, by the Chinese. And not only was it perfected, but what was perfected was the export of it, the mass manufacture and sale of these items. There's a particular design out of the Chinese manufacturers, which were largely controlled by the government, called a tobacco leaf. And it involves, I think at its fanciest, 27 or so different colors on a piece of ceramic. This is astonishing. And the pieces are phenomenally beautiful. Now, I happen to like pottery, so this kind of stuff. So I'm fascinated by it. But the items got to the West because of trade, because of comparative advantage, because the Chinese could do something nobody else could. Many European pottery makers and ceramic makers developed this, and they were there also. But porcelain was originally invented in China. So in whatever period you look, I mean, one of the ways you kind of define the sophistication, the degree of development by an historical era's cultures is their degree of trade. Well, what happened to trade in the Western Mediterranean after the Roman Empire collapsed? It disappeared primarily. It remained in the Eastern Roman Empire because the political arrangements that permitted it were intact. And so you find this idea over and over again. Trade has been a driving force behind the development and the domination of the West for 500 years. The competition for trade, the competition of nations for trade, the competition of individuals for trade has been a driving force. It was the idea of the Asian trade from China primarily because its products were in huge demand. Originally, when Persian rugs were imported into the West, they were called Turkey rugs. Why? Because they came through the Ottoman Empire. And so for a Western merchant to get a supply of Persian rugs, they went to Istanbul or Izmir or Smyrna, I think it's Izmir. And any other trading points on the western edge, actually it wasn't the western edge, but the trading ports in the Ottoman Empire, and that's where they went. So they don't really know where they came from. It wasn't until a good deal later that Western merchants and the Ottoman Empire's powers began to decline. The Western merchants made their way to Persia, really not until the 19th century. So they were called Turkey rugs. The same reason that a generic term for fancy ceramics is China. So the idea of trade is a function of human culture. The Romans did not, as I said, the Romans did not have Adam Smith to explain to them the idea of comparative advantage, but I'm not sure that they needed it. The prices and the availability spoke for themselves. That remains true. There's this great movie called Bottle Shock with Chris Pine, I think, and Alan Rickman, and I forget the female lead in that, and it's about the very famous, and it's a true story, although they fictionalized a little bit. The facts are true. A blind taste test held in France, late 70s, I think, between American California white wines and also red wines, I think, and the French wines, and they were all French judges. At that time, no one in Europe, and no one sophisticated anywhere, thought that California wines were anywhere near the quality of French wines. And so his name is Steve, I tend to say Steve Spurrier, but I don't think that's the name. Steve Spurrier was a quarterback. Arranged this blind taste test with California wines and French wines, all French judges, very fancy, French onophiles and chefs and things like that, sommeliers. And the most astonishing thing happened. In every category, judged by the French themselves, the California wines won. It's a really great movie. So the comparative advantage there was altered. And suddenly, the American product, and now there are many, 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 many American vineyards everywhere in the country, and they sell huge amounts of product. But it sort of started there. So this particular idea of competitive advantages changes. Americans started buying a lot more of their wine locally. We do. We buy a lot of wine out on Long Island, on the North Fork. So this idea of comparative advantage is one which is both fixed in that it has always existed. Wherever cultures are materially and technologically able to trade, they do. And it's mutable. It changes all the time. So these ideas, which are truths, essentially, how do they fit into the current dispute? And you know, one of the things you hear about are trade wars. Trade wars, in my mind, are nonsense. There's a famous comment from I believe, a British politician in the year or two before. It might not be a politician. It might have been an economist who were not particularly good at political analysis in the years leading up to World War I, who said that a world war is impossible because the trade links between nations will make it impossible. This is quite obviously not true. Politics tends to be an emotional endeavor. And that's one of the reasons that the trade dispute now, as exemplified here in the United States, is so volatile. As I told you, I got a whole series of emails from my sister this morning. She didn't know I had to do this webinar on this topic, which we will be discussing in the future, probably at dinner tomorrow night. So what is missing from the discussion? Because clearly something is missing. If trade and comparative advantage only produces benefits, why would anyone be against it? What would be the logic? And of course, the answer is it does not only provide benefits. It also provides great costs. Now, capitalism as a whole, and it's not just capitalism, it's really, I mean, when the Romans imported grain from Greece, they were operating as capitalists. They call themselves capitalists? No. In fact, the aristocrats in those days, as in aristocrats throughout history, looked down upon anybody who had to participate in trade to earn and to succeed. It is a very long idea in the Western world that wealth founded in land is somehow superior to wealth founded in trade and manufacture. In the modern world, I will say that that idea is pretty much gone, but it is the idea that largely supported, or the economic basis that largely supported aristocracy for 2,000 years or 1,500 years. You can go back to the Romans because it's the same idea. So if trade only provides benefits, why are we having this discussion? Why are we talking about trade wars? And I think the reason is rather controversial, harder to put your finger on, but clearly important. Donald Trump did not get elected really for any other reason. And this, as our prior president said, elections have consequences. They do. So what is the idea? And I'm going to try and I'm going to, one, describe it in what I think is its most beneficial form or its most complementary form, and then see where I think this is actually going to go. The problem here in the United States, but also, I mean, you know, this kind of creative destruction, I think that's from Friedrich Hayek, is endemic, is part of the DNA of capitalism. One of the more fascinating things to do is to cruise through, at least just as an example, sort of the history of American, I've done this recently, a bit of a waste of time, but it turns out not. The history of American automobile manufacturers. Or even more closer in time, the computer industry history from about 1980 on. The number of companies that don't succeed, or that succeed for a while and then go out of business, is astonishing. Especially when you think of the companies in terms of not some name in a Wikipedia file, but in terms of the people and the jobs and the lives involved in those companies. This kind of destruction, creative destruction, if you will, is very little different than the type of creative destruction that, well, let's go back and ask a question. Is the type of creative destruction that involves the end of Compaq as a computer manufacturer any different than the type of creative destruction, if you will, or at least that ends up closing an air conditioning plant and sending the jobs and the plant to Mexico? Well, economists would probably say no. There's no difference whatsoever. Whether the reason is because Compaq, just as an example, did not have a good enough product and did not move quickly enough, or Motorola with their StarTAC. I used to have a StarTAC. I thought it was a great phone 15 years ago. But what did it miss? It missed the whole idea of smartphones, that the app is the key. So did BlackBerry. So that's a form of creative destruction as well. Those people lost their jobs. The factories closed. Things went elsewhere. So is that any different than Carrier moving its factory to Mexico, or Ford moving its factory to Mexico? Well, it depends who you ask. I'm pretty sure an economist would say no. There's no difference. But clearly, there are many people, voters, who think there is a difference. And in a democracy, voters matter. So what could the potential difference be? Is there a difference between the evolution within an industry as it competes with itself to provide an ever better product, and an industry that moves its manufacturing someplace to provide not necessarily a better product, but a cheaper product? And of course, the economist's answer to that will be, well, a better product that is the same quality, that's cheaper, is a better product. If the competition between, just as an example, the competition between Compaq and Apple in the early days, what if they both offered a computer, a PC, which of course stands for personal computer, that was identical in performance, but Apple's was a third the price or half the price? Would that not be a better product? So the answer is yes. I don't know how you would argue that it's not. So how is that descriptive? Is that descriptive, that idea of Carrier moving their plant to Mexico? Again, it's going to be difficult simply on an economic basis to make any other argument. Because if you can buy, the assumption behind that is, of course, that as a way of obtaining a good in both senses, 2 is better than 1. So if you can buy 2 Apple computers for the price of 1 Compaq and they both do the same thing, then you have an advantage. Then the good available to the society as a whole has increased. So it's going to be difficult from any analysis that is based on this type of logic, and only this type of logic, to think that there are negatives that need to be incorporated into your government's policy about international trade. Is there any other way that we can approach this? I think there is, and I'm going to do my best to do so. And you and I will have to judge the correctness and the logic and the efficacy of the arguments. And this is where we go with the idea of international trade as approached apparently by the Trump administration. The theoretical logic of international trade, of comparative advantage, as I've been talking about, is largely inescapable. You can't gainsay it because it's true. But there is a very long way from the theoretical precincts of economic equations to the actualities of trade as enacted between governments and governments under the influence of, largely under the influence of the corporate interests. Put it another way, are there interests who have a stake in this type of transaction, whose interests are not represented when the terms of these agreements are discussed? And I would say quite strongly that there are interests there are people whose interests are not represented in these arguments, in the way that this entire topic has been approached, at least here, by the government of the United States. And they're clear. Whose interests are those? Well, clearly they're the workers whose jobs leave. I heard yet another discussion this morning, and it's the same. And the shallowness and the paucity of answers to this question, no matter which proponent of free trade that you talk to, are astonishing. They all have the same answer. It amounts to nothing. The answer is, I forget the man's name. There's no point. I don't want to say his name. I do remember his name. Who was speaking about it on the radio this morning on the way in, simply because then he would be a representative of this, and he's hardly alone in this. They're all the same. Everybody's the same in this. And they talk about retraining and they talk about re-education, which is nonsense. 50-year-old factory worker loses his job, doesn't get retrained to do anything. It's very difficult. He doesn't move because his life is someplace. So this entire socioeconomic fact is ignored. And if it's ever honestly addressed, it is said, well, the benefit for the whole is worth the cost. The problem is the benefits are very, very, and the costs are very, very unevenly distributed. When a factory in a small town closes, it is not replaced by anything else. The void is never filled. The jobs are never recreated. And the local culture suffers. And so all the ideas of retraining is preposterous. Besides, they never come to fruition anyway. No one even tries. They simply voice the answer as some sort of theory because they know they need to say something. So is there an idea that what we're talking about here, and you know, everything, unfortunately, in the current political or economic discussion is conducted at a screaming level. So it's either free trade or autarky. This is nonsense. It's either this or that. There's nothing in the middle. This, of course, is complete and utter nonsense. The idea that you can't change the terms of trade between, just for example, the US and Mexico is preposterous. Of course you can. The only real impact that the US has on that relationship is that the products produced south of the border in Mexico must be equal to products produced here, as far as quality goes, or very close, or they simply won't sell. If Milwaukee, as an example I used earlier, moved its factory to China and the products break after 6 months, then Milwaukee's not going to be selling many drills. So that's the only thing that really is constraining this particular relationship. Certainly the US government can't say, well, you know, you got to pay them what you pay them here. We have no right to say that. The Chinese would. It's just preposterous. So how do you readdress this particular lack of international trade policy? It's a great writer for, I won't mention his name either, for the National Review, who wrote on this during the election. And his idea was that, or what he said in the piece was anyway, that these communities that have lost their jobs and they're, you know, society is kind of collapsing there because there's no money. People need to work. As I think William Faulkner said, the only thing you can do 8 hours a day is work. You know, you can't court, you can't eat, you can't exercise for 8 hours a day. The only thing you can do for 8 hours a day is work. Kind of self-evident, I guess. That these communities should probably just die. People should leave. They should go where the jobs are. But people don't want to uproot their lives. In many cases, they won't. So there is an issue. And how do you know it's an issue? Because Donald Trump is president. And it's an issue which a democracy must address. So how do you address this idea of an international trade disparity so that it provides and mediates the social cost, for example, here in the United States? And I would submit that as a answer social policy, giving people money is a bad idea. So I'm just going to remove that one. What type of policies can you affect? And would this bring on a trade war? And I would say two things. The Trade war nonsense is exactly that. It's nonsense. It's a canard. The United States is still, and by a huge margin, the largest, most lucrative market on the planet. No one that exports can afford to ignore the United States. So just based on that fact alone, the U.S. position as negotiation, if it's taken as negotiation, if you operate on the assumption that these trade pacts perhaps are not, and I know it's Mr. Trump's words, as fair as they have been portrayed. If you take into account the social costs of these trade pacts, then in fact, you have an argument. The reason you can present these arguments, these trade pacts, as purely beneficial is because you don't incorporate that. You simply do not include that in your analysis. Therefore, they're purely beneficial. If you include them, then you have to deal with the question. So how would one deal? How would a government deal with this? And this is the way I think about it. The US, as an example, has very great advantages in manufacturing, provided they are assisted by various types of government policies. Now, what do I mean? It is more than possible, and this, I think, will end up being the approach that the government takes simply because nothing else is very practical. The idea of putting a, yes, the U.S. could put a 20% tariff on Mexican products. And you know what? One, there's really nothing Mexicans could do about it. And I'm not picking on the Mexicans. I'm just using it as an example that's in the current media mix. But the idea that Mexico has a great deal of negotiating power in this relationship is kind of not true. Mexico sends most of its exports to the United States. It will cost Mexico far more to lose that access or to have that access curtailed than it will matter to U.S. consumers if prices are marginally higher on a range of goods. So just on the face of it, although I know it goes against sort of the entire academic and otherwise analysis of economics, the U.S. has a great deal of negotiating power if it's willing to use it. The other thing that I think will happen, and by the way, I don't think that's going to happen. I honestly do think that what we're talking about here is, aside from your idea, any ideas about Mr. Trump, what was the idea that he wants to renegotiate some of the terms of these trades is hardly a strange idea or a anti-democratic idea or anti-free trade idea. Mr. Trump apparently intends to do the things that he said he would do, that he will do the things for the reason that he was elected. This seems a honorable way to go about politics. After all, Mr. Trump was not elected by the people of New York City and their ideas. He was elected by people in other parts of the country. So the U.S. as a positive policy could do a number of things to provide advantages for U.S. manufacturers, which I think is the path, and I certainly hope the path, that the current administration will go. And I just tick off some of them. You don't really have to train the U.S. population. It's highly educated. We have enormous advantages in energy costs here. If you change the tax structure to provide various types of benefits, all of these for manufacturers who either maintain or bring jobs back to the United States. This can be done very easily without doing anything with trade barriers at the border. And this is one of the paths that I think the U.S., and I certainly hope the U.S. will follow. So as far as a trade war, I do not believe in it, and I do not think it will happen. But this is going to be a period of turmoil because Mr. Trump, as an elected official in the United States, does not represent the post-war consensus on international trade. He represents something that's very different than that. And which way the world actually ends up going, because this is a topic which is not only here in the United States. We have probably the freest system for this, so it's easiest for probably an American manufacturer to move its operations overseas. But this is a standard problem in developed nations around the world. So the way this plays out here in the United States will have a tendency, will certainly set a lot of the tenor for the next decade or so about this particular topic. So we will see, and I don't have an answer for this, whether or not the election as a representative of a different idea, of the idea of a more inclusive cost-benefit analysis for international trade, the election of Donald Trump will have any lasting effect on the world trade system. And that will largely depend on whether this reassessment ends up being beneficial to the people and the notions that elected Mr. Trump. Okay, everyone, I thank you very much for your attention. I do apologize a little bit for the poorer quality of the visuals that we had today. That will change. We have changed our information systems here, and I am still working on getting better acquainted with the system that we are now using. So I thank you all for attending. I hope it was useful. We will have another webinar, of course, on Monday, and I will have the topic up by about Thursday at FX Street. Again, thank you all very much for attending. Everybody have a great day.